Yeah, let's give Woodmere a round of applause because this is a fantastic, not just for the art, they have a fantastic jazz program as well, and thank you so much. Thank you, Al. He's fantastic. He did the preliminary music, and he's here also on all the Fridays. So we have embarked on a journey that we call Dignity Month. And what we know is that there's a long, unfortunate history of dignity violations. The dignity violations have come from Holocaust dignity violations. Dignity violations have come from apartheid. And out of each of those two experiences of dignity violations, both of those countries adopted provisions in their national constitutions to protect dignity. We do not have a dignity protection in our state or national constitution. And equal protection is not the same as dignity. Dignity is recognizing that each of us have a God-given inherent value. Now, it's equal dignity, but it's not the same as equal protection. I don't know if Professor Hawkins is going to get into that conversation. Desmond Tutu, Muhammad Ali, and Peter Seeger, the singers, joined some others to create this organization that does Global Dignity Day. And they created it back in 2005. Now we're 20 years behind. But nevertheless, we're now celebrating dignity. On the 1st of October, we had a conversation on what's called the Dignity Index. And this is a national index that's used to help us understand when our speech encourages or discourages dignity. It's primarily for elected officials so that we don't show contempt, because contempt is the opposite of dignity. But on the flip side, where we do show we recognize the values of others. We had a fantastic conversation. I think we had about a couple thousand people on that. That was a telephone town hall where you can just stay at home and participate. Now, some people can stay at home and participate in this as well because we've got it on Facebook Live, so we understand that value. Earlier today, I was in City Council of Philadelphia. The City Council adopted a dignity proclamation, first time. And in that proclamation, they recognize the importance of dignity here in Dignity Month. So we're beginning to build some momentum. Last year, we had one dignity dinner with a number of people. So we had the opportunities for conversations with the telephone town hall. We have an opportunity for conversation tonight as well. And then we're going to have another opportunity on the 29th at Arcadia University, where our topic will be dignity and free speech, which can be attention. We are very, very fortunate tonight to have a law professor at Rutgers University, Stacey Hawkins. I first met Stacey when she was a candidate for school board in Cheltenham Township, where we both live. And my wife served on the school board with her. And what my wife said about Stacey is that she's the smartest woman she has met. That is high praise, because my wife is also a lawyer. I then came across Stacey again when I saw her in a USA Today article where she was a national expert talking about DEI, what it is, what it isn't. And she shared with us, as we were challenging the University of Pennsylvania, what's permitted and what's not permitted. This is the kind of guidelines that elected officials need. This is the kind of guidelines that we all need to have a better sense of how to interpret, how to deal with the rhetoric. Professor Hawkins has agreed to lead a dignity teach-in, a dignity conversation with us this evening. And she's a law professor, so hopefully it won't be at a level we can't reach. I'm confident that it will not be. She's been on CNN and many other publications, and I can't thank you enough for being present with us tonight. So I turn it over to Professor Hawkins.
Thank you so much, Senator Haywood, and good evening to everyone. It is such a privilege and a pleasure to be with you in this incredibly beautiful space on this lovely fall evening. I feel, as I hope all of you do, extraordinarily fortunate to have an elected official locally here who really exemplifies public service and the values that we want to be reflected in our elected leaders, and the fact that he thought it appropriate, even necessary, to take the time to have a community conversation, to actually inform ourselves in this really fraught and contentious moment in our country, what it means to express basic human dignity for each other, and to really model that in our interactions. And so I was asked to give a brief kind of overview of dignity and race. Is it on it? Okay, that's definitely on. And I was so fortunate that Senator Haywood gave me an opportunity to reflect on this topic of dignity and race. I teach race in law school, and I write about race in my scholarship. I often speak about race in my public engagements and training sessions, but I've never really had an opportunity to think deeply and contemplate the intersection of dignity and race. So it was a really great invitation that Senator Haywood gave me, and so I'm grateful for it. And so the first thing that I wanted to talk about is dignity as a universal human right. As Senator Haywood said, we really have to go to international law to really come up with a good definition of dignity as a human right, because it does not exist in our American legal system. We don't really, and I'll talk about that in a moment, have this concept. And I know that you're probably not going to be able to see all of this, so I'll highlight the relevant parts that I want you to know. The first, I think, important source of our common understanding as a global, not just a national community, of what it means to have appreciation for dignity as a human right comes from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a treaty that was signed by 40 some odd countries in the aftermath of World War II. It was an effort that was led by Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, wife of FDR, and it contains a lot of provisions that really do resonate with this idea about human dignity. It says in some of the preamble, all humans are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms that are recognized in the Declaration, and that is without distinction of any kind based on race or color or sex or any other dimension of human difference. It then goes on, finally, after recognizing that all human beings are born free. They don't have to be granted freedom. They are born free, and they are born with the right to dignity, right, and the freedom and entitlements that come with citizenship in any nation. And then, of course, they ought to be treated equal before the law. And so this is the conception of dignity that we find in international law that really says every single person on the planet is born with an inherent sense of dignity that has to be acknowledged and respected. They are free because of their humanity, and they are entitled to basic rights simply because they are human. And then there is an International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination that was adopted in 1965. Again, there are 80 some odd countries that are signatory. By the way, the United States is a signatory to all of these international covenants and treaties. And this was specifically promoted as a way to talk about the fact that it's not just in the United States, but around the globe. We know there have been challenges with the rights and dignities of certain minority groups. And so there was a special covenant that, again, reflected this idea that dignity and equality are inherent in all human beings. And the signatories to this covenant agreed to promote and encourage universal respect for and observance of the human rights and fundamental freedoms, again, that are inherent in all of us. That, again, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, a reflection of the language that's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then finally, we get to equal before the law, right? Equal protection, right? That's a kind of subsidiary right. Once we recognize you're born, right, with basic rights to be free and treated with dignity and the rights afforded to all persons, and then the law has to then recognize that. And then finally, this last provision says that all the parties who are signatory, in particular the United States, agrees to condemn racial discrimination and further to engage in practices and policies that eliminate racial discrimination in all of its forms and promote understanding among all races. And again, that's something that is really about trying to bridge differences, trying to not just acknowledge our own humanity, but the humanity of others, and make sure that we have ways for understanding and fostering that kind of basic human respect for each other. And then finally, there was not a mechanism for enforcing these other provisions until we had the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And this document then, again, recognizes the inherent dignity and inalienable rights of all members of the human family, that it is foundational to freedom and justice and peace in the world, and that in order to recognize that, that the rights can only be achieved if everyone has the civil and political as well as economic, social, and cultural rights that attend your basic humanity. Right? And so now we make real what it means to have rights inherent as a person. That means you have to enjoy civil rights, political rights, economic rights, social rights, and cultural rights. And again, states that are signatories, including the United States, have to enforce these obligations through their own laws. So that's our international construct. That's where we get, to the extent that we have some sort of foundational understanding of what dignity is, it comes from international law. Because if we were to look at US law, as Senator Haywood said, we really don't find an analog in terms of the recognition of the basic and inherent right to dignity. Now, if you go back to the Declaration of Independence, which, by the way, is not a part of the body of US law, right? A lot of people confuse words that are in the Declaration of Independence, which simply declared our independence from the British Crown and launched the American Revolution, but it is not an actual foundational legal document that structures any rights of the people currently living in the United States. It does say all men are created equal. It does say men, doesn't say persons. It does say all men, and they did mean all men at the time, and are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was in 1776. After we win the American Revolution and we decide that we need to form our own independent nation, we then get the foundational legal document for the United States. And in that document, we see no recognition of the inherent dignity, humanity, right, equality of all men. Instead, in that document, what we see is the ratification of what is already in existence, had been in existence for over 100 years in America, and that is African chattel slavery. And so in our US Constitution, we have several provisions that are reflective not of the basic inherent humanity and dignity of all persons, but of the indignity that was applied to African chattel slaves. Again, we have the 3/5 clause, which literally by law defines Black persons who were enslaved in America at the time as 3/5 of a person, not a full person entitled to, by virtue of their birth, right, the full rights and freedoms of all persons. And then we have another provision that is called the Compromise of 1808 that prohibited Congress from outlawing the slave trade until 1808. Remember, this document is adopted in 1787. That gives them another 20 years to continue the slave trade in the United States. And then finally, it's the Fugitive Slave Clause that says, even if you happen to be an enslaved person and you escape into free territory, you are not by virtue of that free. You can be returned whereunto you came, right, to be forced back into slavery and involuntary servitude. And so again, our founding documents do not reflect this conception of the dignity inherent equal rights of persons. In fact, it doesn't even talk about equality. It abandons this idea that all men are created equal and instead begins our charter document with a distinction among persons. And that's not rectified until after the Civil War. And we get what we call the Reconstruction Amendments because we think of them as having reconstituted our country, having refounded our founding principles anew. And in that context, we do get, right, some gesture towards, still not the kind of robust language of dignity and equality, right, the inherent value of all human life that we see in documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Instead, we get a provision that says in the 13th Amendment, we are no longer going to have slavery, right? Like that is unlawful in this country. We then get a 14th Amendment that says we will guarantee the equal protection of law. Remember, that comes, right, almost as a postscript in those universal documents after they talk about dignity and equal humanity and rights and freedoms. Then they say, and by the way, you also have equal protection of the law. In the United States, that's all we have. We have a guarantee of the equal protection of law, notwithstanding the fact that we are signatories to all of those international documents that require us to take seriously the commitment to recognizing and enforcing the equal dignity and rights of all persons. And then finally, the 15th Amendment, which granted finally the right of citizens of African ancestry the right to vote. And of course, we know at this time, in 1878, I believe maybe it was, the 15th Amendment, that was just black men because women didn't get the right to vote until the 19th Amendment in 1920. So dignity as a right in the United States is woefully underdeveloped, right? We really have to rely on international instruments to understand what dignity means. And so I think it is all the more important that Senator Haywood has brought us all together to think deeply, to contemplate what as a political and social community we want to commit ourselves to. What we want to press for in terms of our body politic, in terms of our rule of law. Do we want to be more faithful to those covenants that the world community has committed themselves to? And certainly there are other countries whose constitutions, South Africa being one, I teach South African constitutional law, I've traveled to South Africa, their constitution is an international human rights and dignity-based constitution. We don't have that, but we could. And so what do we have? We have, of course, civil rights law. We have laws that were adopted to promote equal opportunity in federal employment and contracting. In 1964, we get the kind of signature piece of legislation that strikes down Jim Crow and disallows kind of racial segregation in America. But again, we don't talk about, we have to recognize the inherent dignity and worth. As a matter of fact, notwithstanding the adoption of the Equal Protection Clause or the 14th Amendment in 1868, we had, black codes, which were very explicit race-based restrictions on people's rights and liberties. And then once those were struck down, they were followed by Jim Crow segregation, right? Which we know prevailed in the United States until the 1960s, first falling under the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision, which strikes down segregation in public education. And in 1965, the kind of other signature piece of legislation, which by the way, is under threat, right now before the Supreme Court is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which not only prohibits discrimination in voting on the basis of race, but also tries to provide more robust protections for minority voters to meaningfully participate in the electoral process so that they can elect representatives of their choice. And that's the kind of guarantee that we're going to see the Supreme Court dealing with this term and likely starting to erode, if not entirely withdraw. Free speech is another area, and I know that there's going to be another session on speech, but I think that the rights so intersect, and I think when we talk about dignity, race, and the law, one place where we have had, right, fits and starts around recognition of dignity, especially when it comes to race, is that our First Amendment doctrine, which generally protects our right to free speech, used to have something called the fighting words doctrine, and it actually used to proscribe, right? It used to allow the government to restrict some forms of highly inflammatory and offensive speech, what were dubbed fighting words, epithets, and other types of offensive action that might incite some sort of physical response. That doctrine has no longer been enforced, but the question is, right, when we think about the dignity of the person and we think about the ability to hurl racial epithets and engage in, and I know that this is controversial, right, but to engage in the kinds of hate speech that we engage in now, and that, you know, for instance, Charlie Kirk was accused of engaging in before his death. That kind of speech offends the dignity, right, of persons. And if we were serious about having a law that reflected the dignity of persons, we might think about reviving the fighting words doctrine. Instead, currently, we say that our free speech doctrine, in order to be legitimate, has to recognize even offensive, right, and hateful speech. And again, around the world, especially in light of these international treaties, there are no other countries that are signatories to these treaties that allow the kinds of unfettered use of hateful language that we do in this country, right? It's not a foregone conclusion that we cannot regulate civility in our public discourse and respect for human dignity by putting some words off limits. The right to protest and assembly, which again, we do. The First Amendment gives us the right to peacefully assemble in public spaces. Without it, there would not have been a civil rights movement. Without it, we would not have gotten the Civil Rights Act. We would not have gotten the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge that gave us the Voting Rights Act. And yet, today, that right is also being threatened. Something near and dear to my heart, academic freedom. As an academic, we are supposed to have institutions of higher education that are committed to the pursuit of truth and knowledge, that they are supposed to be committed to a diversity of ideas, right, that are in the contest for determining which ideas are the best ideas. But then, once we determine what the right ideas are, we no longer have to tolerate noxious or false ideas, right? And again, that idea is also being eroded. And so we have people talking about things that we didn't talk about before. We literally have people going back to eugenics arguments that have been roundly debunked in science for decades, that are not legitimate ideas in the academy. And yet, we are being told that we have to tolerate, endorse, even invite those ideas into academic discourse. And then finally, there is this movement around banning diversity, equity, inclusion, and critical race theory. And quite frankly, a lot of this is simply about not allowing minority voices to tell their stories, to be part of the dialogue, to be in rooms, to have their humanity recognized as worthy, right, of equal inclusion and respect. And again, this is a dangerous trend, and this is just a little bit of data. Of course, the first of these kind of pieces of state legislation were passed in Florida in 2022. But since then, there has been a proliferation. Every single time I make a public presentation, I have to update this number. The last time that I made a presentation, because I looked at my notes, there were 16 states that had passed laws that prohibited states from whether it's state employers or the state governments or K through 12 education or higher education in the public system. From teaching certain topics that reflect the histories, identities, and stories of minority groups, or just making sure that those minority groups have a seat at the table. That number is now up to 19 and counting. I think that there are well over 100 bills that have been proposed across the 50 states in order to shut down conversations that recognize the equal dignity and humanity, the lived stories and experiences of all Americans. And again, we should all find that deeply troubling. And that's not to mention what's happening at the federal executive presidential level with executive orders, or the private activist groups that are engaging in public pressure campaigns, whether it's, pressuring Starbucks, not Starbucks, his name is Robbie Starbuck, pressuring Target, right, to abandon its Pride Month campaigns, or pressuring Disney, right, to withdraw from certain diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. All of these things are really moving us backwards in terms of our ability to really be a nation that recognizes the ability in a pluralistic society to say everyone's humanity matters, right? Everyone has dignity and equal worth. So, my last comment is, what do we do? How do we advance dignity and diversity? First of all, organize. I think that that's something that Senator Haywood's office is so wonderful at providing a platform for us to do. I was just saying, there's no loss of town halls and community conversations and events where he brings our community together to talk about what's important to us. Again, this is our nation. We can advocate for the kinds of political leaders that we want to see, leaders like Senator Haywood, who are holding up dignity as a prized value that we should exemplify and that we should try to promote in our society. And then advocate, right? Get in front of your elected leaders, get in front of city council, get in front of the state legislature, get in front of the federal legislature, go to Congress, go to Washington, D.C., go to Harrisburg, wherever you need to go to advocate. After you organize, you've got to actually bring your cause to the people who can make the change. And of course, always, and I'm sure I don't have to tell anyone in this room that we don't just vote every 4 years. We vote every year, and every year those elections matter. And quite frankly, we don't just vote in November, right? In primary elections, we also vote in May or June, depending on where you live. Those elections matter too. There are things and people on the ballot that if you don't come in May, you don't get to determine in November, right? And so, always be engaged, because quite frankly, our society, our rule of law is only as good as the people that comprise it. And right now, we are ceding authority to people who don't believe in dignity, who don't believe in equal value and respect of all human beings. But we can take back our social norms, we can take back the social compact, we can reshape it. And I'm, again, so grateful for Senator Haywood for leading the way and reminding us of the values that we ought to be holding up and the things that we ought to be organizing around and advocating for. So with that, I will cede my time. I was asked, yes, I was asked to make sure you wait for your questions until the microphone comes to you so that you can be appropriately heard.
One question I put at the top of the list was, if the international community recognizes people as, having rights, how can that be affected by the Supreme Court and what they're doing? Because I feel like they don't care. And it's like, well, what are they using to base their decisions on? And it seems like Project 2025 or some Federalist, whatever. I don't get it. So I guess that's my first question.
Yes, so I am not a scholar of international law, but I can tell you this as a constitutional law scholar. Those international laws that I cited to you, we are signatories to those laws. But under U.S. law, we are not bound by any international treaties that we don't ratify in U.S. law, which is the reason why I also told you what the U.S. law is, right? Because regardless of what those treaties that we are signatories say, we are only obligated to do what we ratify in our domestic law. And the United States Supreme Court only interprets and applies domestic law. They are not bound by any international treaty that has not been ratified in U.S. law. That's why. Yes.
So after the Holocaust, the Germans put dignity into their constitution. After apartheid, South Africa put dignity into their constitution. Now, after enslavement, that didn't happen. However, these other changes came after 1948, right? So I don't think the people in 1865, would have the same kind of approaches, a century later. But as I look at the 64 changes, the 65 changes, 1968, the civil rights era changes, I wonder how that opportunity might have been available at that time, because they already had the 20 years knowing what was in the UN Declaration. So I just look at that period as an opportunity to adopt dignity. What do you think about that?
Yes, and not only was that opportunity available to them that they could have learned from, but as I mentioned, Eleanor Roosevelt was the chief, chair of the UN commission that came up with the Declaration of Human Rights. And so we knew full well we were at the table constructing the language. And it has been, I think, a deliberate choice, for instance, when we adopted the signature civil rights legislation of the 1960s, that we did not adopt a robust conception, right, of what we meant by the guarantee of civil rights. We adopted a very kind of formalist, very kind of mild idea about what the law requires, and it's just equal protection. Remember, all those international covenants I showed you, they say dignity, inherent value, civil and political rights, and then they say equal under the law, right? All we got was equal under the law, right? And it was a choice that was available to us to import those robust conceptions of what civil and political rights ought to look like in America into our statutes, right, in 1964, and we did not. Now, I will tell you that there are lots of current calls for a new constitutional convention and to think anew about constitutional amendments. And there is no greater moment than now to press on our elected officials the kinds of values that we want to inform any project like that. We shouldn't have another missed opportunity.
Forgive my lack of knowledge on the Constitution, but if you go back a couple of slides, you talked about the academic freedom,
This
the
one?
academic freedom, which is really important to me too. Is that codified somewhere in the Constitution, that particular piece of it, or?
So academic freedom is not, but what the Supreme Court has done is it has interpreted it as a derivative value of the First Amendment. And so its source is in our Constitution, but the doctrine itself is what we call judicially created. The Supreme Court created that doctrine out of the First Amendment.
Okay, so that's, okay. So we're just reinterpreting at the moment, I think.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And quite frankly, it is an underdeveloped judicial doctrine, which is the problem. And our First Amendment doctrine as a whole is quite messy. like I said, the Supreme Court has never actually formally overruled the fighting words doctrine. They've just not enforced it for decades. And so, again, there's a lot of opportunity for us to improve upon what we have available to us right now from a dignity perspective.
I do have one more question. I know No King's Day is coming up Saturday, and I do plan to go protest like I did the last time this year. But what I found a major area of concern was when I went there and I saw like 3 black people. And what I found out from friends and relatives was they said, we've carried this fight so long, we feel like the others need to step up to the plate and fight, rather than us putting our lives on the line. My pushback to that was, I get it, but now is not the time to, wear your dignity out there and not push back. I'm sorry, these are really trying times.
Yes.
And I guess I just wanted you to comment, like, what can be done to make these people realize you can't afford to do that anymore.
Yes, and I mean, if I could offer a friendly amendment to your description of their dignity, I would say it's righteous indignation, right? And to be very clear, it is righteous, right? Like, they are rightfully upset because black people so the Civil Rights Act, which actually prohibits discrimination on the basis of not just race and national origin, but also sex, right, and religion, they owe their rights, women, and now LGBTQ persons, who the Supreme Court said are covered by virtue of the reference to sex, all to black people, right, who fought for that civil rights legislation. That is very, very clear. And Nicole Hannah-Jones in the wonderful 1619 Project has said that, all of the kind of equality proving elements of our democracy have really been the consequence of advocacy by and or on behalf of black people. So that's a fact. And so, yes, there is rightfully righteous indignation. Like, you know what? We are tired of fighting for everybody else, right? Like, we've done our part. I just want to rest. But you're right. Now is not the time to sit on the sidelines, right? Like, have your righteous indignation and then roll up your sleeves and get back into the fight. And I think part of the issue is convincing people, and this is what I always say, no one can do everything, but everyone can do something. And so there are issues that are not your issues that you don't think matter to you, but surely there are some, right? Your rights, everyone's rights are under attack. And you can find a point of entry in this fight that satisfies whatever you think is your own self-interest. So absolutely, I agree with you. You don't have to take up what you think is somebody else's fight, but you certainly can find your own fight in this battle and take up that fight.
So we have a couple questions online. So Kim asked, how can we protect dignity of our youth, especially on online spaces?
Such an important question. And not only do we not have laws protecting dignity in general, we don't have sufficient laws regulating the internet, right? So that is a recipe for utter disaster and kind of, destruction of our young psyches. And so, number one, yes, we need laws that recognize dignity, but we also need laws that regulate the internet. And unfortunately, our legislature has been woefully unresponsive in that task. I mean, largely they've said for many, many years, well, it's a new technology and we don't want to regulate it too soon. We want it to develop and see, and we don't want to do it wrong. But the internet is now what is it, 30 years old at least? Like, it's been enough time. We know what this technology is capable of. We know what the dangers are. And there has been a lot of call for more robust regulation. Again, this is another place where we are behind the international ball. Most countries have much stricter regulations of the internet, and in particular internet privacy, than we do in the United States. I mean, and I think that so when they tried to shut down TikTok, what did Americans do? First Amendment, right? Like, again, we have this kind of absolutist First Amendment doctrine that is simply, number one, inconsistent with kind of international norms. No one else has it, just like no one else has the same Second Amendment gun rights that we do, right? Like, it's entirely unprecedented and unnecessary, right, for an advanced democracy to have either one of those things. And again, right, because we are a democracy, we have the power to convince our elected officials that that's not the value system we want to have, that we want to modify those laws, and we want to create different principles that guide us. And I think having more sensible gun regulations, as well as having sensible regulations of the internet and speech, right? Especially hate speech. That is a reasonable thing to do, particularly in view of this broader background principle of dignity and equality, right? And even if we don't have dignity, we certainly have equality. And it undermines the equality of the person to be able to hurl epithets and offensive and vile things at people.
We have another online question. How do people's opinions about different hair textures affect how Black folks see themselves, feel about their dignity, and shape their identity? And how does this tie into bigger conversations about race?
Wow. I mean, that's a big question, and probably one that my expertise doesn't, equip me to answer, but I will say this. I mean, a very good friend of mine, Professor D. Wendy Green, who is right at Drexel Klein School of Law here in Philadelphia, she has been one of the chief authors and architects of the Free the Hair movement and, the Crown Act, which seeks to protect against natural hair discrimination in places like education and the workplace. So I don't know from a kind of social psychology perspective that I can say anything about how people think or feel about it, but what I do know is that the actions people take, right, against people on the basis of their natural hair are adverse. We know that students get sent home from school for coming in with dreadlocks. We know that employees get fired from their jobs, right, for wearing natural hair. And that certainly, right, undermines, if that is a part of a person's, self-concept, right, if that is how they want to present themselves to the world, that is a part of their inherent dignity as a person, right? And to the extent that we have a framework that respects dignity, I think that how we choose to present ourselves in the world is a part of that. But at the very least, right, when those actions are racialized in ways that fall disproportionately on minority groups, it is an equality issue, which is the reason why we at least have some basis for seeking regulation of that as a matter of law in the United States, even without a dignity paradigm. I'm
going to ask a question. So I may be mixing apples and oranges here, but I do have a question about the First Amendment and social media, which certainly propagates a lot of hateful speech, so on and so forth. And if we have freedom of speech, I guess we have freedom to do that, unless we qualify that in any way. But I'm just wondering, when it comes to, I think a lot about education, because that's what I do, and censoring in this broad term of woke, teaching history, and the momentum behind curtailing the efforts to actually speak honestly about history. I mean, philosophically, I just think we're doing an injustice to our children, because getting through life is negotiating and navigating through a lot of hurdles. And if you don't see past hurdles, progress, step back, step backwards, so on and so forth. But my point is how, I don't understand how, unless, like I said, I may be mixing apples and oranges, but how the First Amendment and limiting what we're able to teach, how that...
It doesn't, which is the reason why the Stop Woke Act, certain portions of the Stop Woke Act, particularly those portions that restrict the teaching of, factual parts of history, have actually been enjoined by courts because they are antithetical to the First Amendment and free speech. Although, there are lots of debates now, and we were talking about this compact for higher education, that the ability for the state to control the curriculum does exist, right? And so the federal government, so the First Amendment is a kind of federal right, and there are some restrictions on that, but education is also a really state-based enterprise, and so states have the opportunity to regulate a lot about the curriculum. But I think what really is troubling about these new anti-DEI, anti-CRT, critical race theory movements is that it's not really about trying to restrict controversial subject, or it's not about eliminating inappropriately religious content from the curriculum, things that might offend. It really is just stripping historical facts that people don't like, right? Like they'd rather have revisionist history, and that's what's happening. And I think that that's what we should find deeply troubling, that it really is about saying we're not going to teach these parts of our history because we don't like it. And that's the reason why a lot of the attacks have quite frankly, been premised on the fact that this is just really ideological, right? Like this is really not an educational choice. This is not about educational value. This is not about knowledge or truth. These are just ideological agendas that say we don't like that information. It's not that it's false information, but we don't like it and we don't want you to teach it. And that's the part that's dangerous, because that's the part that we do think that, again, in terms of educators, we should be allowed to determine, right, what is the appropriate curriculum in our respective disciplines.
But I'm also thinking about that a lot of the justification is it makes our children feel uncomfortable. It makes them feel badly about themselves. And I'm thinking...
So does calling people epithets and offensive words.
That's my point. That is exactly my point. So which children are feeling, or is it the parents that can't talk to their children rationally about this?
So, I cannot make that make sense for you because it doesn't. And what we call, and seriously, this is a phrase that has developed in constitutional law. It's called liberty for me, but not for thee. There is a total, right, hypocrisy and inconsistency in the argument that I should be allowed to say hateful and vile things in the name of academic freedom, but when you, or free speech, but when you are teaching or saying things I don't like, right, whether it's criticizing Charlie Kirk or teaching about, slavery, I can restrict those things. That is not reconcilable with any conception of freedom of speech or academic freedom, right? That is, again, bald partisanship that is about liberty for me and not for thee. But again, maybe if we had some conception, again, contravenes equality, right? Like, and we already have equality. But certainly if we could ally equality with some idea of dignity, right? That like everyone matters and we can't just kind of pick and choose whose stories and whose voices and whose interest we care about, maybe that would help. Although, again, when we're talking about political gamesmanship, probably not, but it wouldn't hurt.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I wish I had a better answer. I wish I could tell you that it did make sense, but it does not.
We have one more question online. Does the United Nations have any enforcement power to protect our dignity or others around the world?
Does the United States have any enforcement power?
United Nations.
Oh, United Nations. Oh, that's such an excellent question. And so, again, not an international human rights expert, but I have had the privilege of having colleagues who are. And one of the interesting things that the government often does, our government at least, is that it exempts itself from liability for things that it doesn't want to be liable for. And so, you can look at like local statutes and, the government can say, you can sue somebody else for a slip and fall, but if you slip and fall on, public property, you can't sue us. Like, we're going to exempt ourselves from liability for that. And so while the United States is a signatory to all of these international treaties and covenants, they have not ratified those things in U.S. law, so they cannot be enforced in U.S. courts. And with respect to international law, there are lots of, commissions and reports that are submitted. I have, again, another law faculty friend who serves on the UN, Commission for Racial Discrimination, and reports have been submitted to the UN for years and years saying that the United States is in violation, right, of its commitments under these covenants, and they do not subject themselves to jurisdiction for enforcement. That's what happens. So a member nation would have to submit themselves to jurisdiction, and they do not. So sadly, the answer is no.
I know we're coming to the close, but DEI has been alleged to create discrimination against mostly white men.
Mm-hmm.
Is affirmative action, how is the dignity of distributed between the recognition of 100, 200 years of enslavement, 100 years of segregation, and those who benefited from the same, at least their ancestors? Maybe they didn't do it personally themselves. So as we look at this question of, say, affirmative action, there is a distribution of benefits and impact. How do you see equal dignity in that context?
So I'm going to perhaps seem not to answer your question because your question is a very good one, but a very hard one. So I'm going to tell you what I know, which is that I think that claims of reverse discrimination, right? So any kind of affirmative efforts, and I'm going to call them affirmative action efforts because not all of them are affirmative action, which is a very specific thing, but affirmative efforts to try to expand opportunities for people who have been historically excluded, minorities, women, disabled persons, all sorts of segments of our society, are often alleged to impair the interest of people who are not a part of those disadvantaged groups. It turns out that that's what we call kind of a red herring or a straw man in the law, which is to say it's a distraction. It's false. It's false as a matter of fact. And one of the ways that we know that it's false is that in very many of the cases that have been litigated around reverse discrimination, particularly in the higher education admissions context, it's very clear on the basis of their credentials, those white people would not have gotten in even without the racial considerations. No harm to your dignity, your rights, your interest whatsoever, which is the reason why rather than some material harm, what the Supreme Court has now said is the mere fact that I considered whether or not you were black or white, and I took note of that in the decision-making process. That's the harm, because there is no actual material harm. And the other reason why there is no material harm, even for those people who might have appeared qualified, is that the thing that they did not get was not some sort of entitlement that they were guaranteed to get. right? It is a selection process that was always going to result in some people receiving it and some people not receiving it. And the ways in which those decisions are made are oftentimes informed by a host of different considerations. And so it's so impossible to say, right? The presumption on behalf of those litigants is always, I was entitled to that thing, and that presumption is false. That thing was always a privilege that was going to be doled out, right? On some undetermined or a range of undetermined bases by the decision maker, right? Like, you had no inherent right to that thing. You were not deprived of something to which you were entitled. You had to compete with it just like everybody else. And in that competition, you lost. So, I mean, I think that I don't like to get dragged into this kind of argument about harm to, white interests, because that actually is a distraction, right? What they really don't like is they really don't like that other people are getting things, right? Not that they've actually suffered any harm, because they can't prove any quantifiable harm. In fact, in the most recent case that went up to the Supreme Court, where they finally closed the door on affirmative efforts in higher education admissions, there was not a single named plaintiff whose credentials were identified in that case. Not a single one. No person, because in the past, that was always a detriment to their case, right? Because the last time, Fisher v. Texas, it was very clear she would never have gotten into the University of Texas. So, same guy, by the way, litigated that case in this case against Harvard and UNC. So he learned his lesson. He said, I'm going to dispense with the individual plaintiffs because they don't help my case. I'm going to go with this organizational plaintiff, Students for Fair Admission, and I'm not going to present the files of any individual litigants. I'm just going to argue, if you thought about race in the process, that was the constitutional harm. Not that somebody would have otherwise gotten in, but just the mere fact that your process considers race. You're welcome.
So is that comparable to the interview process? Because I work for the government, and I've been working there for more than 30 years. And when I started, everybody seemed to be white, Catholic, and lived in the suburbs that worked where I worked. And the number of minorities that were able to get promoted, practically none. And I remember reading a report that was developed by the government organization, that actual activity I work for. And it always got down to the interview was the reason. Somebody got selected over somebody else. And the minorities just weren't interviewing well.
Fit is what we call it. Not the right fit.
Right, not the right fit. So is that kind of comparable?
Yes, it very much is. And so with admissions as well, and I like to simplify it this way. People think that underrepresented students who are admitted have categorically lower credentials than white students who are excluded. So the way admissions works is that students' files are reviewed. The first sweep is usually academic, and people are determined based on their academic credentials to be automatically admissible, automatically denied, automatically admitted, automatically denied, or admissible. The vast majority of applicants actually fall into that middle ground, admissible. You have the requisite credentials to get in, but you're not going to get in on your credentials alone. Now we're going to interview you, right? Like, we're going to look at all the things that say, are you the right fit for us in this moment, right? What other things do we care about besides your credentials? Everyone that we have argued about in these higher admissions cases, both the white applicants and the minority applicants, have largely been in that admissible pile. Race was not really the determinative factor. Right? Like, all of these things All of these things. And what they often say is that credentials, right? Like my credentials were lower or higher, but you weren't either automatically admitted or automatically rejected. So they weren't high enough to get you automatically in, right? Like those were never going to be the determinative thing for you. And yet they say, well, if mine were higher than this person, also in the admissible pile, I deserve to get in. No, no one in the admissible pile gets automatically admitted. You all now have to fight in this contest, right, of selective admissions for the privilege of being admitted, right? Like no one's entitled because you got a 1400 on your SAT and you got a 4.0. Like all of you in the admissible pile, right? Like if you didn't get a 1600 and have a 5.0, then you were just admissible. And you are going to compete with the person who got the 1250 and the 3.5. And yes, your credentials might be higher than theirs, but neither one of your credentials are the reason why either one of you are getting in. Those credentials made you admissible. They are not why you got admitted. And that's something that a lot of people misapprehend, including the Supreme Court. So don't feel bad if you did before this moment.
So that was amazing. I've been a lawyer 30 years and learned so much in the last hour. And I went to Michigan Law School. Of course, that was a long time ago. But thank you so much. That was fantastic. I certainly want to thank everyone who spent the time to come out, even from Temple University. Thank you so much, Jason. Thanks for coming out. For all of you who watched online, thank you so much. If you have questions, we might be able to get those questions answered at a later point in time. Thank you so much, Woodmere. This is a fantastic facility. Al, thank you so much. All clear on sound and beyond. Again, we have one more session at Arcadia University on the 29th. There's a good chance we're going to have FIRE there. FIRE is like the free speech absolutionist people. They're like free speech, even for corporations. But then we're going to have the other side as well, so it should be an interesting conversation on free speech and dignity. Two other things I wanted to share from my personal experience. I and a colleague of mine went to 12 campuses of state universities in Pennsylvania. We heard from black and brown students about their experiences on campus. Some of them cried because of the hate speech that they endured. So this hate speech may not have a physical injury, but it certainly has an emotional injury, as I have heard countless times. And so this fighting words doctrine, we certainly need it back. We need to look at some of the other countries around the world are doing to protect people's dignity from these outrageous comments. The second thing I wanted to share was this question about hair. So my daughter had her hair touched by someone at her job. That was a serious dignity violation. I don't have the answer to why, but I do know that it was extremely offensive. Extremely offensive. And from an inherent value, a God-given value to her, it was a significant intrusion. So this questions about hair does, as you said, it does go to dignity. It does go to, this is who I am. Don't violate it. I am confident that through these discussions and more, we can have greater recognition of each of our own value, our inherent worth. The United States has not had, as we've heard, developed this dignity framework. But we got plenty of time to get it done, right? The nation is still forming. The nation is still forming. As we look at the next 250 years, we're going to be celebrating looking back next year. We can spend some time celebrating looking forward. And as we look forward, we can look forward to putting dignity in our jurisprudence, in our laws, and in how we speak to each other. Thank you so much.